The British liaison officer had seen men drink themselves sick in the desert, watched entire platoons evacuate with heat stroke in Burma, but he'd never seen soldiers deliberately not drink when water was available. Captain Geoffrey Hartwell stood in the shade of a eucalyptus at the edge of the training ground outside Darwin, notebook open, trying to understand what he was witnessing that didn't match any manual he'd ever read. Subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. It helps new episodes come out. The temperature had climbed past 100 degrees by mid-morning, the kind of dry furnace heat that turned breath into sandpaper. American advisors moved between the Australian infantry sections, observing final preparations before the New Guinea deployment. Hartwell watched a Yank captain check his canteen for the third time in an hour, take a measured sip, replace it on his belt. Standard practice. Sensible hydration discipline, as taught at every training camp from Louisiana to Queensland. 30 yards away, an Australian corporal hadn't touched his water bottle since dawn. Neither had the 4 men in his section. They'd been running combat drills for 3 hours. Full packs, weapons, the works. And Hartwell had been counting. The American advisor trailing their group kept glancing at them, then at his own canteen, then back at the Australians, with an expression somewhere between confusion and suspicion. Quote 0, the American major standing beside Hartwell asked. He was from the 32nd Division, here to coordinate jungle warfare protocols, and he'd noticed the same pattern. Or are they just tougher than our boys? Hartwell didn't answer immediately. He'd spent 18 months in North Africa, seen the 9th Division at Tobruk, watched Australian units operate in conditions that broke British battalions. There'd been something then too, something the Australians did that nobody quite articulated in after-action reports. The word that kept appearing in his memory was __2_. But that was description, not explanation. The drill sergeant called for a water break. The Americans moved to their canteens with disciplined efficiency, taking controlled drinks, replacing caps, checking levels. The Australians did something else entirely. Most still didn't drink. A few took canteens off their belts but just held them, turning them in their hands like men deciding whether to open a letter. One private did drink, but only after doing something odd with his jaw. A rolling motion, tongue visible for a moment, then a swallow before the water even touched his lips. The American major frowned. That's not normal. No, Hartwell agreed. It isn't. He'd started keeping notes 3 days ago, after the first joint exercise. Dehydration rates, heat casualties, performance degradation over extended patrol simulations. The numbers told a story that medical officers were beginning to whisper about in the mess halls. Australian units were lasting longer between water resupply, not by minutes, by hours. In jungle conditions, where both heat and humidity conspired to wring men dry, that difference meant operational range. It meant mission capability. It meant men coming back instead of being carried back. A sergeant approached the section that hadn't drunk yet. Hartwell recognized him, veteran of the Libyan campaign, 3 years in, the kind of sun-carved face that looked like it had been baked in a kiln. He said something to the corporal, too quiet for Hartwell to hear. The corporal nodded, did that same jaw movement, and only then reached for his canteen. Even then, he barely sipped, a mouthful at most. He held the water in his mouth for several seconds before swallowing, and Hartwell could see his throat working in a way that seemed deliberate, controlled. Nothing like the gulping relief of a thirsty man finally allowed to drink. I want to know what they're doing, the American major said. It wasn't a request. Hartwell closed his notebook. __7_. That evening, he found the sergeant in the canteen, sitting alone with a cup of tea that had gone cold. The man's name was Milligan, and his service record read like a tour of every miserable posting the war had offered. Hartwell sat down without asking, put his notebook on the table between them. The water discipline, Hartwell said. Where'd it come from? Milligan looked at him with eyes that had seen too much sun. You were in Libya? Tobruk. Briefly. Then you saw it. You just didn't know you were seeing it. Milligan picked up his tea, realized it was cold, set it down again. It's not about drinking less. It's about needing less. And that's not something you requisition from stores. The siege had been going on for 4 months when Milligan learned that thirst wasn't just about water. Tobruk, in August 1941, was a mathematics problem written in heat and dust. 30,000 men, finite supply lines, and an enemy that controlled everything beyond the perimeter wire. The Africa Corps shelled the harbor every night, turned supply ships into funeral pyres, made every gallon of fresh water that came ashore worth more than fuel. Milligan had arrived with the replacements in July, fresh from Palestine, thinking he understood desert conditions because he'd trained in them. The older diggers watched the new men gulp from canteens during the first patrol and said nothing, just waited for the lesson to teach itself. By the second day, Milligan's tongue felt like boot leather. By the third, he was rationing sips so carefully that he dreamed about water more than he dreamed about home. An old hand named Costas pulled him aside after a week. Greek-Australian, 5 years in the regular army before the war, face like cracked earth. He didn't offer Milligan water or sympathy. He just opened his mouth and showed his tongue, how it sat against his teeth, how the back of his throat looked when he breathed through his nose instead of his mouth. Then he closed his jaw in a specific way, moved something in his cheek, and swallowed what appeared to be nothing at all. "You're wasting spit," Costas said. "Every time you swallow without thinking, that's moisture you're throwing away. Every time you breathe through your mouth, you're drying yourself out faster than the sun can manage. Your body makes about a liter of saliva a day, even out here. Most men piss it away, literally, because they don't know how to hold it where it matters." Milligan thought it was madness at first. Old soldier superstition, the kind of folklore that accumulated in long campaigns like sediment in a canteen. But Costas made him practice anyway. Tongue against the roof of the mouth, not the bottom. Breathe in through the nose, out through barely parted lips. When saliva pooled, don't swallow reflexively. Hold it. Let it coat the mouth. Only swallow when it served a purpose. And when you did swallow, do it slowly, deliberately, making sure the moisture went where it needed to go. The technique felt ridiculous until the day it didn't. 2 weeks into the siege, Milligan went on a patrol that pushed 8 miles into no man's land, checking German positions around the perimeter. The temperature hit 120 degrees. They carried 2 canteens each, orders to make them last 12 hours. Milligan practiced what Costas taught him, the tongue position, the controlled breathing, the deliberate swallow pattern, and discovered something that felt like cheating physics. His throat stayed wet longer. The desperate, clawing thirst that usually hit after 3 hours in the sun didn't come until 6. When he finally drank, the water seemed to go further, last longer, as though his body had learned to extract more from less. The man next to him, one of the other replacements, had emptied both canteens by hour 7 and spent the last 5 hours moving like a man walking through mud, eyes glazed, stumbling over rocks that weren't there. Costas checked on him that night, back inside the perimeter. Quote 16. Quote 17. Quote 18. Costas sat down on an ammunition crate, rolled a cigarette with fingers that never seemed to shake despite everything. Quote 19. Over the next months, Milligan watched the technique spread through the battalion like a quiet infection. Nobody ordered it. No sergeant made it part of drill. Men just taught other men, usually after a patrol where the difference between knowing and not knowing became obvious in who walked back under their own power and who needed help. By October, whole sections practiced it without thinking. The jaw movements and breathing patterns as automatic as loading a rifle. The German bombardment intensified in November. Supply ships stopped trying to run the harbor in daylight. Water ration dropped to 3 pints a day, barely enough in that heat, criminally insufficient for men doing physical labor under fire. Medical officers started seeing cases of heat exhaustion that should have been fatal, but somehow weren't. Men who should have been evacuated kept functioning, kept fighting, their bodies managing on margins that didn't appear in any physiology textbook. A British medical officer came through in December, documenting conditions for a report to Cairo. He noticed the discrepancy in heat casualty rates compared to British units in similar conditions. Wanted to know what the Australians were eating, what supplements they were taking, whether there was something in the water purification process that made a difference. Costas volunteered to explain. Showed him the tongue position, the breathing pattern, the controlled swallow. The medical officer wrote it all down, nodding politely, clearly thinking he was recording folklore rather than field medicine. Quote 20, Costas asked. Quote 21. After he left, Milligan asked Costas why he bothered explaining if nobody would take it seriously. The older man shrugged, lit another cigarette, stared out at the wire where searchlights swept the darkness for infiltrators. Quote 22. Costas said, quote 23, the briefing room in Port Moresby smelled like mildew and aviation fuel, the corrugated iron roof ticking as it expanded in the morning heat. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes spread casualty reports across the table while American, Australian, and British medical officers crowded around, trying to make sense of numbers that refused to follow expected patterns. 1943 was 2 months old, and the Kokoda Track campaign had generated enough data to reveal something nobody could quite explain. Hayes tapped a page showing evacuation rates from forward positions. Quote 24. An American major named Driscoll leaned forward, skeptical. Hayes pulled out another report, this one from field hospitals. A British physician named Weatherby removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief that had given up on being white weeks ago. Hayes had anticipated that question. Driscoll wasn't satisfied. Has to be something. Diet? Are they getting different rations? Some kind of supplement? Salt tablets? Electrolyte mix? Field rations are standardized. We've examined everything down to tea versus coffee consumption. There's no chemical explanation. Hayes paused, glancing at an Australian medical officer standing near the back. Captain Morrison has a theory. It's unconventional. Morrison stepped forward, uncomfortable with the attention. He was young for his rank, promoted in the field after the previous medical officer contracted malaria. His hands carried the permanent stain of antiseptic, and he had the careful manner of someone who'd learned that officers didn't always want to hear what doctors observed. It's not diet, Morrison began. It's technique, behavioral, not nutritional. The men are doing something with their mouths, their breathing, their swallowing reflex. I've been watching it for 3 months, and I still can't properly articulate what I'm seeing, but the men who do it last longer on patrol, measurably longer. Silence settled over the room like humidity. Weatherby put his glasses back on. You're describing a folk remedy. I'm describing an observable phenomenon that correlates directly with reduced heat casualties. Whether it's folk remedy or applied physiology, the results are consistent. Morrison pulled out his own notes, pages dense with observations that read more like anthropology than medicine. They call it dry mouth discipline, specific tongue positions that reduce moisture loss through respiration, controlled swallowing patterns that maximize saliva distribution. It's taught informally, veteran to replacement, never written down in training manuals. I've tried to test it systematically, but the men who know it can't always explain what they're doing. It's become muscle memory. Driscoll shook his head. That's not science. You're telling me Australian troops survive longer in the jungle because they hold their tongues differently? I'm telling you that Australian troops who've been trained in specific oral moisture management techniques show statistically significant improvements in heat endurance compared to those who haven't. I'm telling you I've measured saliva production rates, oral cavity moisture levels, and throat tissue hydration in both groups. And the differences are real. I can't explain the mechanism, I can only document the outcome. Hayes watched the American officers exchange glances that said everything about what they thought of Morrison's theory without speaking a word. This was the problem with evidence that sounded like superstition. It didn't matter what the numbers showed if the explanations seemed to belong in a different century. Has anyone tried to systematize this? Weatherby asked. Create a formal training protocol? Morrison hesitated. I've attempted to write one. The problem is that the technique requires practice to be effective. Men need weeks of repetition before it becomes automatic. And the veterans who teach it don't use standardized methods. Each one demonstrates it slightly differently. When I've asked them to explain the physiology, they can't. They just know it works because they've used it. An Australian colonel named Brennan spoke up from the doorway where he'd been listening. Quote 43. Hayes gathered the reports back into their folder. Quote 44. Driscoll stood up, clearly done with the conversation. Quote 45. He left. 2 other American officers followed. The room felt larger without them. And Morrison looked at the remaining faces, trying to gauge whether he'd just damaged his career by presenting observations that couldn't be reduced to a requisition form or a training manual section number. Hayes closed the folder. Quote 46. But Morrison could see the problem already. Knowledge that couldn't be written down properly wouldn't survive the war. It would fade, be forgotten, and 20 years later someone would rediscover it and think they'd invented something new. The training camp outside Cairns had been carved from sugarcane fields 3 months earlier. Rows of tents and makeshift ranges where men learned to kill in close quarters before shipping north to New Guinea. Sergeant Milligan arrived in March 1943 with orders to prepare replacement drafts for the 7th Division, and he brought knowledge that wasn't listed on any equipment manifest or training schedule. The men who cycled through his section would spend 6 weeks learning how to stay alive in conditions that killed men faster than bullets. The first morning, Milligan lined up 40 replacements fresh from Melbourne and Sydney, boys who thought they understood heat because they'd sweated through Australian summers. He made them run 3 miles in full kit, then stand in formation in the sun for an hour without water. Standard infantry discipline, nothing unusual. What came next was different. He told them to open their mouths and show him how they were breathing. Most were gulping air like landed fish, mouths wide, tongues hanging loose. Exactly what killed men on the Kokoda Track. Milligan walked down the line, correcting posture the way a drill instructor corrects rifle grip. Close the mouth, breathe through the nose, tongue up against the hard palate, not resting at the bottom. He demonstrated, opening his mouth so they could see the position, then closing it and breathing in a slow rhythm that looked effortless but required conscious control. Your mouth is a canteen, he told them. Right now you're all walking around with the cap off, letting everything evaporate. I'm going to teach you how to keep it sealed, even when you're moving, fighting, scared out of your mind. The men who learn this will walk off transport ships in Moresby ready to work. The men who don't will be in field hospitals wondering why they can't keep up. A private near the end of the line raised his hand. Young kid, couldn't have been more than 19. Quote 49, Milligan had heard versions of this question in every training cycle. The skeptics, the ones who needed mechanical explanations before they'd accept anything. He didn't blame them. It had sounded like nonsense to him too back in Tobruk, before experience taught him otherwise. Quote 50, Milligan admitted. Quote 51, he spent the next week drilling them on breathing patterns. In through the nose, count to 4. Out through barely parted lips, count to 6. Never gulp air, never pant. Even during exertion, maintain nasal breathing as long as possible. When they had to open their mouths, and they would under stress, keep the tongue positioned to minimize evaporation. The motion felt artificial at first, required constant conscious effort, but repetition built neural pathways. By week 2, some men were doing it automatically. Week 3 introduced the swallow drill. Milligan made them go 6 hours without drinking, then demonstrated controlled swallowing versus reflexive swallowing. The difference was in timing and intention. Don't swallow just because saliva accumulated. Let it pool. Redistribute it with tongue movement. Use it to keep tissues moist. Only swallow when the mouth felt genuinely dry or when speaking required it. Some men picked it up immediately. Others struggled, kept reverting to unconscious patterns, had to be reminded dozens of times before the technique stuck. A corporal named Davies proved to be a natural. He'd grown up in the outback, knew about managing thirst from childhood experiences that most city boys couldn't imagine. Milligan watched him teach other men in his section, breaking down the technique in ways Milligan hadn't articulated. Davies explained it like water conservation on a property with one bore. You don't waste a drop, because there's no guarantee when the next delivery comes. The men understood that metaphor better than medical explanations. By week 4, Milligan divided them into 2 groups for field testing. One group practiced the techniques daily, the other trained normally. He took them on identical patrol simulations, same distance, same weight, same heat exposure. The results were visible within hours. The trained group maintained pace longer, showed fewer signs of cognitive decline, drank significantly less water while reporting lower perceived thirst levels. The control group struggled. Several men showing early heat exhaustion symptoms that would have required evacuation in combat conditions. The skeptical private, who'd questioned the physiology, came to Milligan after that exercise looking shaken. I didn't believe it would make that much difference. I thought maybe 5-10% improvement. But I watched men in the control group fall apart while my section kept functioning. How is this not standard training? Milligan had asked himself the same question. Because you can't write it down in a way that makes sense to someone who hasn't experienced it. I could write a training manual section on tongue position and breathing patterns, and every officer who read it would think I'd lost my mind. The only way to learn it is from someone who already knows it, and that kind of knowledge doesn't survive bureaucracy. Week 5 brought visitors. Medical officers from Brisbane, curious about Morrison's reports, wanted to observe the training. Milligan demonstrated the techniques, explained the rationale, submitted to questions that felt more like interrogation than inquiry. They measured saliva production, took oral temperature readings, documented breathing rates. One doctor suggested it was purely psychological. Men who believed the technique worked simply managed discomfort better mentally. Milligan didn't argue. He just pointed to the patrol results, the measurable differences in water consumption and heat casualty rates. Belief didn't explain why trained men's core temperatures stayed lower, or why their cognitive function tests showed better results after identical physical stress. Something physiological was happening, even if the doctors couldn't identify the mechanism in their textbooks. The final week tested everything at once. 72-hour field exercise, minimal sleep, restricted rations, constant movement through terrain that mimicked New Guinea conditions as closely as Queensland could manage. Every man carried 2 canteens, orders to make them last the full 3 days. No resupply, no emergency water except for genuine medical necessity. The point was to simulate what they'd face on extended patrols, where supply lines broke down or enemy positions cut off expected routes. Milligan watched them adapt in real time. Some men executed the techniques flawlessly, their months of practice becoming automatic under stress. Others reverted to old habits when exhausted, had to consciously force themselves back into proper form. A few simply couldn't maintain it. The mental effort required exceeded their capacity under duress. Those men would struggle in New Guinea, and Milligan noted their names for reassignment to roles that didn't require extended patrol range. On the final morning, as men stumbled back to base camp, Milligan counted canteens. 70% of the trained group still had water remaining. Fewer than 30% of the earlier, untrained drafts had managed the same in previous exercises. The difference between those numbers was the difference between completing a mission and becoming a casualty statistic. But when Milligan filed his training report, the section on water discipline techniques was edited out before it reached division. A note came back from staff. Focus on standard hydration protocols per field manual. Unconventional methods require medical validation before inclusion in official training. Davies read the note over Milligan's shoulder. Quote 55, quote 56, Milligan said. Quote 57. Staff Sergeant Thomas Riley of the 6th Ranger Battalion had been attached to Australian units for 3 months, and the assignment was making him question everything he thought he knew about infantry operations in tropical environments. The official purpose was observational. Allied Command wanted American Special Operations personnel to study Australian jungle warfare techniques for potential integration into Ranger training. The unofficial reality was that someone at headquarters had noticed the casualty rate discrepancies and wanted answers that didn't sound like medical folklore. Riley kept 2 notebooks. The official one documented tactics, patrol formations, ambush techniques, the kind of tradecraft that translated cleanly between armies. The unofficial notebook contained observations that he couldn't quite frame in military language. On page 17, dated April 19th, 43, he'd written, "They don't drink like we do. Something about the mouth. Watch closer." The patrol that changed his understanding departed from Wau airstrip on a Tuesday morning, 8 Australians and Riley, mission to scout Japanese positions along the Black Cat Track. Estimated duration, 4 days. Round trip, 60 miles through mountains that turned men into pack animals. Each man carried 2 canteens, emergency rations, ammunition loads that made shoulders ache after the first hour. Standard operational parameters. What happened over the next 96 hours was anything but standard. Corporal Mackenzie led the Australian section, a Tasmanian who'd survived Kokoda and spoke about the Owen Stanleys the way sailors spoke about the sea, with respect bordering on fear. He briefed Riley before departure, voice low enough that the privates couldn't hear. "You'll want to drink regular," Yank thinking. "Every hour, measured sips, stay ahead of thirst. That's what your manual says, yeah?" "Standard hydration protocol," Riley confirmed. "Watch us instead. Don't copy yet, just watch. See how long we go between drinks. See what we do with our mouths when we're not drinking. 4th day, you'll understand. Or you won't. But don't try to imitate until you've observed the full cycle." The first day followed predictable patterns. Temperature climbed into the 90s. Humidity turned the air into something you could chew. Riley drank every hour as trained, careful sips, monitoring his consumption rate. The Australians barely touched their canteens. 6 hours into the patrol, Riley had consumed half his water supply. Mackenzie hadn't drunk at all, and neither had 3 of his men. The others had taken single small sips, nothing more. Riley watched their mouths. Jaws moved in subtle patterns during rest breaks. Not chewing, not speaking, just rhythmic motions, like they were working something between their teeth. Breathing stayed nasal, even during climbs that had Riley gasping through his mouth. When they did drink, the process looked different, slow, deliberate, holding water in their mouths longer than seemed necessary before swallowing in a controlled motion that engaged their entire throat. Day 2 brought rain, the kind of tropical downpour that turned trails into streams and made every step a negotiation with mud. Riley's boots were soaked within an hour, his uniform plastered to his skin, water running down his face in rivulets. He drank less that day, figuring the ambient moisture would help. The Australians still drank less than he did, and they showed no signs of the sluggish thinking that heat stress induced. During a break, Riley timed Mackenzie. 45 minutes between sips. When he finally did drink, it was 3 small mouthfuls, held for several seconds each. "How are you not dying of thirst?" Riley asked. Mackenzie smiled, opened his mouth, showed his tongue pressed flat against his palate. "Keeping the moisture where it matters. You're breathing through your mouth, yeah? Every breath dumps water vapor into the air. Your body made that moisture, pulled it from your cells, and you're throwing it away faster than you're replacing it. Watch my breathing." Riley watched. Nostrils flared with each inhale, barely visible exhale through lips that stayed nearly closed. No panting, no gasping, even on steep grades. The breathing pattern looked effortless, but Riley tried to replicate it and discovered it required constant attention, conscious control of muscles he normally ignored. Day 3 tested everything. They climbed into higher elevations where the heat became drier, more desert-like, despite the jungle canopy. Riley's canteens were 3/4 empty. The Australians had consumed perhaps 1/3 of their water. The math didn't work. Same exertion, same conditions, vastly different consumption rates. Riley checked for hidden water sources, wondered if they were sneaking drinks when he wasn't looking, but Mackenzie let him inspect his canteens whenever he wanted. The water levels were exactly what they appeared to be. That night, camped on a ridge with Japanese positions visible as cook fires in the valley below, Mackenzie sat down next to Riley and spoke quietly while the others slept. Riley pulled out his unofficial notebook. Mackenzie considered this. The lesson began immediately. Tongue position first. Press it against the roof of your mouth, not flat, but slightly cupped, creating a seal that trapped moisture. Hold it there until the position felt natural, which it wouldn't for days. Breathing second. Close your mouth, breathe only through your nose, count 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out. Don't cheat by mouth breathing when it gets hard. Your body will adapt, but only if you force the adaptation. Riley practiced through the night, taking watch shifts where he focused on breathing and tongue position instead of just staring into darkness. His jaw ached from holding unfamiliar positions. His nose felt inadequate for the volume of air his body demanded. But by dawn, he could maintain the position for 30-minute stretches before unconscious habits reasserted themselves. Day 4 brought contact. Japanese patrol, 6 men, spotted crossing a stream half a mile from the Australian position. Mackenzie made the decision to observe rather than engage, which meant staying motionless in concealment for 3 hours while enemy soldiers searched the area. Riley's mouth went dry from stress, instinct screaming at him to drink. He watched Mackenzie instead. The corporal's jaw moved in tiny increments, tongue visible occasionally behind barely parted lips, working saliva through his mouth without swallowing. Building moisture through technique instead of water consumption. Riley tried to replicate it. Moved his tongue deliberately, felt saliva pool, fought the urge to swallow reflexively. The moisture spread through his mouth, coated his throat, reduced the desperate dryness to manageable discomfort. Not perfect, he still felt thirsty, but functional. He didn't need to drink immediately. Could wait another hour, maybe 2, before hydration became critical. When the Japanese patrol moved on and the Australians prepared to withdraw, Riley checked his canteens. Quarter full, both of them. Enough to get back to WOW if he managed it carefully. If he'd been drinking at his normal rate, he'd have been empty yesterday. Mackenzie checked his own water supply, half remaining, and nodded with something like approval. You learned faster than most. Americans usually can't break the mouth-breathing habit, too ingrained from your training culture. Will it be enough to make a difference? Mackenzie stood, adjusted his pack, scanned the tree line for movement. Ask me that when we're back at base and you're still walking while other blokes need carrying. They made WOW late on day 5, a full day longer than planned after detouring around enemy positions. Riley's canteens were empty for the final 6 hours. He should have been a heat casualty by every metric in American field manuals. Instead, he walked into camp under his own power, coherent, functional, thirsty as hell, but operational. The techniques Mackenzie taught him weren't perfect. He'd reverted to mouth breathing during the hardest climbs, lost efficiency when exhausted. But they'd worked well enough to matter. That night, Riley wrote in his official notebook, Australian water discipline techniques merit serious study for ranger integration. In his unofficial notebook, he wrote something closer to truth. I can document what they do. I can practice it myself. I still can't explain why it works. And that's going to be a problem when I brief this to command. Captain Donald Fraser had spent 15 years as a general practitioner in Brisbane before the war turned him into a field hospital doctor, and nothing in his medical training had prepared him for data that contradicted basic physiology. The field hospital at Dobadura handled casualties from the entire New Guinea theater, which meant Fraser saw patterns that individual battalion surgeons missed. By June 1943, those patterns had accumulated into a mystery that kept him awake during the brief hours when artillery wasn't shaking the tent poles. He started with admission records. Heat exhaustion cases, separated by nationality, showed the discrepancy Morrison had reported months earlier. Americans presenting with severe dehydration symptoms arrived at nearly double the rate of Australians operating in identical conditions. Fraser initially attributed this to acclimatization differences, maybe genetic factors, dietary variations. Then he began measuring actual physiological markers, and the explanation stopped making sense. Core body temperature readings showed minimal difference between nationalities at admission. Both groups spiked to dangerous levels. That's why they ended up in hospital. But the Australians arrived later in the progression of heat injury, maintained cognitive function longer before collapse, recovered faster once treatment began. Fraser tested blood chemistry, electrolyte panels, kidney function markers. No significant variations. Whatever protected Australian soldiers from heat stress wasn't showing up in standard medical tests. An American medic named Patterson worked the receiving tent and noticed something Fraser hadn't. "The Australian heat cases, sir, they're all new guys, replacements who haven't been in country long. The veterans almost never come through for dehydration. It's like there's two different populations in the same uniforms." Fraser pulled admission records going back 8 months and confirmed Patterson's observation. Australian heat casualties correlated almost perfectly with time in theatre. Men in country less than 3 months represented 80% of cases. Veterans with 6 months or more of service rarely appeared in heat-related admissions, despite taking on the most dangerous, physically demanding patrols. The pattern suggested learned adaptation rather than genetic advantage. He began interviewing patients, asking about training, preparation, what they'd been taught about managing heat stress. The Americans described standard protocols, regular hydration, electrolyte supplements, scheduled rest breaks, techniques that appeared in every field manual Fraser had read. The Australian replacements described similar training. But the Australian veterans described something else entirely, and they described it reluctantly, like men revealing a trade secret they weren't sure they should share. One sergeant named Cooper, in for shrapnel wounds rather than heat injury, finally explained it in terms Fraser could begin to measure. Quote, "Fraser designed an experiment. He recruited 20 Australian soldiers, 10 veterans who claimed to practice the techniques, 10 replacements who didn't. Measured baseline saliva production using standardized collection methods. Then put them through identical physical stress in controlled heat conditions and measured again. The veterans maintained significantly higher oral moisture levels despite identical sweat rates. Their saliva appeared to be distributed more efficiently, coating oral tissues more thoroughly, reducing the sensation of thirst without actual water consumption." He tested breathing patterns next. Veterans showed predominantly nasal breathing even during moderate exertion, only switching to oral breathing at high intensity. Replacements and Americans defaulted to mouth breathing much earlier. Fraser calculated water vapor loss through respiration and found veterans were recovering approximately 20 to 30% more moisture through nasal breathing compared to mouth breathers. Over a 12-hour patrol in extreme heat, that difference accumulated to nearly half a canteen's worth of water retained in the body instead of exhaled into the atmosphere. The tongue position element proved harder to quantify. Fraser used cotton swabs to measure moisture distribution across oral surfaces. Veterans showed consistently better coverage, palate, inner cheeks, throat, all maintaining higher hydration levels. When Fraser asked them to demonstrate their tongue positioning, they showed him placements that looked uncomfortable, unnatural, but which created a kind of seal that trapped moisture against the roof of the mouth. Holding that position required conscious muscular effort until it became habitual. Fraser compiled his findings into a report that read more like anthropology than medicine. He documented measurable physiological differences, but couldn't identify a single causative mechanism. The techniques worked through combined effect. None of the individual components showed dramatic impact, but the cumulative result was undeniable. Men who practiced all the techniques simultaneously showed heat endurance improvements of 30 to 40% compared to control groups. The report went to Medical Command in Brisbane with Fraser's recommendation for formal study and potential integration into training protocols. 6 weeks later, he received a response that managed to be both encouraging and dismissive. The data was interesting, they wrote, but the proposed mechanism relied too heavily on behavioral modification rather than medical intervention. Without pharmaceutical or equipment-based solutions, Command saw limited application for large-scale implementation. Quote, 76. Patterson said when Fraser shared the response, quote, 77. Fraser couldn't argue with that assessment. Modern military medicine focused on technological solutions, better rations, improved equipment, chemical supplements. The idea that ancient techniques, passed down through oral tradition, might outperform modern methods didn't align with institutional assumptions about progress and scientific advancement. But Fraser kept collecting data. He tracked recovery times for heat casualties, noting that veterans who practiced the techniques bounced back faster, required less IV fluid replacement, showed fewer complications. He measured this obsessively, building a database that grew larger each month. The numbers told a story that medical journals would eventually need to acknowledge, even if command wasn't ready to listen. A researcher from Sydney University visited in August, interested in Fraser's work for a paper on environmental physiology. Dr. Elizabeth Chen had published extensively on acclimatization and saw Fraser's findings as potential breakthrough material. She spent 2 weeks at Dobodura, observing, measuring, interviewing soldiers who practiced the techniques. "This is real," she told Fraser after analyzing her data. "I can't explain all of it yet, but the effect is measurable and consistent. Saliva production rates, oral moisture retention, respiratory water recovery, all showing significant differences. If I can isolate the mechanisms, identify which specific actions produce which specific outcomes, this could revolutionize how we understand hydration management." Fraser felt hope for the first time in months. Academic research might succeed where military medicine had failed. Chen had institutional credibility, access to laboratory facilities, the ability to conduct controlled studies that would satisfy scientific skepticism. She promised to publish findings within 6 months, credit Fraser's field observations, push for recognition of the techniques as legitimate physiological adaptation rather than folk medicine. But when Chen returned to Sydney, she found her university had lost half its staff to military mobilization, and her laboratory had been converted to pharmaceutical production for the war effort. The research she'd planned required equipment and time that no longer existed in wartime Australia. She wrote Fraser explaining the situation, promising to resume the work after the war, hoping the knowledge wouldn't be lost in the interim. Fraser filed her letter with his growing collection of documentation that nobody seemed to want. He continued measuring, recording, documenting the techniques that kept Australian veterans alive in conditions that killed less experienced men. Somewhere in the data was an explanation that would satisfy scientific method. He just needed someone with resources and institutional support to find it. Meanwhile, men kept teaching other men the techniques that medical science couldn't quite validate, but combat experience confirmed. The knowledge spread through informal networks, veteran to replacement, the same way it had always spread throughout human history. Fraser watched it happen and wondered if perhaps that was the point. Some knowledge survived precisely because it didn't require institutional validation, couldn't be controlled by bureaucracy, existed in the practical transfer between people who needed it to stay alive. His next report to Brisbane included a recommendation that made his previous suggestions look conservative. "Stop trying to systematize this. Let it spread naturally. The men who need it will learn it from the men who know it. Our role should be observation and documentation, not control." The response came back within days. Rejected. All training protocols require standardization and validation before implementation. Fraser showed the reply to Patterson, who laughed without humour. Good thing the techniques don't require permission to work. The meeting at Allied Land Forces headquarters in Brisbane brought together officers who rarely occupied the same room. Operations planners, medical staff, intelligence analysts, and representatives from Australian, American, and British commands. Major General Robertson chaired the session with the weary efficiency of a man who'd spent 3 years trying to coordinate armies that shared objectives but not methods. The agenda listed 17 items. Water discipline techniques appeared as item 14, sandwiched between ammunition supply chains and malaria prophylaxis protocols. Robertson allocated 15 minutes for discussion. Colonel Brennan presented the case, using language carefully calibrated to sound pragmatic rather than mystical. Australian units showed measurably lower heat casualty rates. Field observations suggested specific training techniques contributed to this advantage. Recommendation: allow informal instruction to continue. Provide official recognition without mandating standardization. Document outcomes for post-war analysis. An American brigadier general named Halstead interrupted before Brennan finished. Quote 83. Brennan had anticipated this argument. Quote 84. A British medical officer named Whitmore leaned forward, hands folded on the table like a man about to deliver an uncomfortable diagnosis. Quote 85. Robertson checked his watch, signaling the discussion was approaching its time limit. Quote 86. Silence around the table. Nobody had documented negative outcomes. The worst-case scenario was that men learned techniques that didn't help them. Neutral outcome rather than harmful one. But the absence of harm didn't resolve the institutional discomfort with training methods that couldn't be properly systematized. An Australian lieutenant colonel named Perth spoke up, his accent carrying the flat vowels of rural Queensland. Sir, with respect, we're overthinking this. The techniques work for the men who learn them and don't hurt the men who can't. Why does command need to validate or formalize what's already happening organically? The knowledge spreads because it's useful. Trying to control that process just creates bureaucracy without improving outcomes. Halstead shook his head. Because informal knowledge transfer creates training disparities. Some units get taught by veterans who know the techniques, others don't. That's how you end up with uneven capability across divisions. If these methods actually work, they need to be standardized and taught uniformly. If they can't be standardized, they're not reliable enough to depend on operationally. Robertson made a note on his agenda paper, the kind of notation that usually preceded a decision nobody would like. Compromise position. We acknowledge the techniques exist and show positive correlation with reduced heat casualties. We don't mandate training or create formal protocols. We also don't prohibit instruction. If veterans want to teach these methods informally, they're authorized to do so. Medical officers continue documenting outcomes. After the war, we'll have sufficient data for proper academic study. Does that satisfy all parties? It satisfied nobody, which meant it was probably the best available option. Brennan accepted it because any official acknowledgement was better than continued institutional denial. Halstead accepted it because it didn't commit American forces to training methods that hadn't been scientifically validated. Whitmore accepted it because it deferred the really difficult questions to someone else's peacetime problem. The meeting moved to item 15. But after the session ended, Brennan found himself in the corridor with Riley, who'd been sitting in the back row taking notes for Ranger Command. The American staff sergeant looked frustrated in a way that suggested he'd been arguing similar battles with his own bureaucracy. Quote, _90, Riley said quietly. Quote, 91. Brennan had reached the same conclusion months earlier. Quote, 92. Quote, 93. Quote, 94. Brennan pulled out a cigarette, offered one to Riley, who declined. Quote, 95. Riley watched headquarters staff move through the corridor, officers carrying papers that represented decisions affecting thousands of lives. Quote, 96. Quote, 97, Brennan said. Quote, 98. 3 weeks later, Brennan received a memo from Medical Command requesting his presence at a closed-door session reviewing Fraser's latest findings. The tone was formal, the language carefully neutral, but the subtext was clear. Someone higher up the chain had taken interest in the water discipline question. Whether that interest would lead to validation or suppression remained unclear. The session took place in a windowless conference room that smelled like stale coffee and mildew. Fraser presented 18 months of compiled data using charts that should have been conclusive. Heat casualty rates, recovery times, operational range capabilities, cognitive function under stress. Every metric showed Australian veterans outperforming comparable American and British units in tropical conditions. The techniques correlated directly with improved outcomes across every measured category. A civilian consultant named Edmonds attended the session, introduced as a physiologist from Melbourne who'd been contracted to provide independent assessment. He listened to Fraser's presentation without interruption, reviewed the charts with the careful attention of someone trained to find flaws in experimental design. When Fraser finished, Edmonds spent 10 minutes asking technical questions about methodology, sample sizes, control variables. Finally, he delivered his assessment. The data is solid, the outcomes are real, but I can't identify a single physiological mechanism that explains why these techniques work. Saliva management might account for 10% of the observed improvement. Respiratory moisture recovery may be another 15%. The rest, he gestured at the charts, shouldn't be possible based on current understanding of human physiology, which means either our understanding is incomplete or there are confounding variables we haven't identified. Fraser waited for the conclusion he knew was coming. Edmonds didn't disappoint. Brennan stood up, surprising everyone, including himself. Edmonds met his eyes without hostility. Quote 103. The session ended without resolution. Fraser would continue documenting. Edmonds would continue analyzing. Brennan would continue fighting bureaucratic battles that felt increasingly futile. And soldiers would continue teaching other soldiers techniques that kept them alive. Official validation be damned. Walking out, Fraser said to Brennan, Quote 104, quote 105. Brennan agreed. Quote 106. The invasion of Tarakan Island began on May 1, 1945, with naval bombardment that turned Japanese positions into smoking craters and mangrove swamps into landscapes that belonged on the moon. The 26th Brigade Group went ashore expecting resistance that materialized in scattered pockets rather than coordinated defense. What killed men wasn't enemy fire. It was the heat index that climbed past 115 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity so thick that breathing felt like drowning, and terrain that offered no shade, no respite, no mercy for soldiers carrying 80-pound packs through sucking mud. Lieutenant Marcus Wade of the 162nd Infantry Regiment came ashore with the second wave of American forces, part of the joint Australian-American operation to secure Borneo's oil fields. He'd heard stories about Australian heat endurance from officers who'd served in New Guinea, dismissed most of it as inter-service rivalry exaggeration. The first 3 days on Tarakan revised his understanding of what human bodies could endure when properly trained. His platoon pushed inland alongside an Australian company from the 2nd 24th Battalion. Identical mission parameters, same supply situation, comparable physical conditioning. Wade's men started showing heat stress symptoms by day 2. Slurred speech, coordination problems, the 1,000-yard stare that came from core temperatures climbing into dangerous territory. He rotated men out of patrol rotation, kept reserves fresh, managed his water supply with obsessive precision. Still lost 7 men to heat casualties by day 3. Medevac to field hospitals where IV fluids and ice baths brought them back from the edge. The Australian company operating parallel to Wade's position hadn't evacuated anyone. Their patrols covered longer distances, carried heavier loads because they were forward reconnaissance rather than follow-up clearing operations. Wade watched them through binoculars during rest periods, trying to identify what they were doing differently. The answer was nothing obvious. Same uniforms, same equipment, same environmental exposure. The difference was invisible, locked inside techniques that didn't photograph well or appear in official reports. On day 4, Wade approached the Australian company commander, a captain named Griffiths, who looked like he'd been carved from the same red dirt that covered everything on Tarakan. Wade asked directly about water discipline training, mentioned the casualty rate disparity, requested permission to observe Australian soldiers during their next patrol. Griffiths studied him with the careful assessment of someone deciding whether to share trade secrets with a potential competitor. "You want to learn it or write a report about it?" Griffiths asked. "Learn it. My men are dying from heat and I don't have enough reserves to keep rotating fresh bodies into patrol schedules. If your blokes know something that keeps them functional, I need my platoon to know it too." Griffiths nodded slowly. "Right then. You'll come with us tomorrow, full patrol, no special treatment. Watch what we do, ask questions when we stop, practice it yourself before you try teaching it to others. Fair warning, takes weeks to get good at this, and we don't have weeks. You'll learn enough to see the difference, probably not enough to match our performance." The patrol departed at dawn, 12 Australians and Wade, moving through terrain that alternated between mangrove swamp and volcanic rock fields where the sun reflected back like industrial furnaces. Wade carried 3 canteens instead of his usual 2, expecting to need the extra water. The Australians carried standard loads and moved at a pace that seemed unsustainable in the heat. Steady, efficient. No wasted motion, but no concessions to temperature either. Wade watched their mouths. Jaws moved in patterns he'd noticed before but never analysed. Rhythmic, deliberate, like men chewing tobacco except their mouths were empty. Breathing stayed nasal except during the hardest climbs, and even then most men kept their mouths barely parted, lips moving in minimal patterns that suggested conscious control. When they did drink, it was ceremonial in its precision. Small amounts, held in the mouth, worked around with tongue movements before swallowing in that distinctive throat motion Wade had seen but couldn't replicate. 2 hours into patrol, a sergeant named Walsh dropped back to walk alongside Wade. "Your mouth breathing, Lieutenant. That's the first thing to fix. Close it. Breathe through your nose. Stay that way even when it feels insufficient. Your body will adapt if you force it to." Wade tried. Closed his mouth, pulled air through his nostrils, felt immediately like he wasn't getting enough oxygen. His instinct screamed to gulp air, to open his mouth and pant like he'd been trained was acceptable during hard exertion. Walsh watched him struggle for 30 seconds before offering adjustment. "Don't fight your body's panic. Just slow everything down. You're trying to breathe at the same rate through a smaller opening. Won't work. Reduce your pace slightly. Breathe deeper, not faster. Give your lungs time to extract oxygen efficiently. Takes practice. Keep at it." Wade maintained nasal breathing for 15 minutes before reverting to mouth breathing without realizing it. Walsh corrected him again, and again, and again. By hour 4, Wade could hold the pattern for 30-minute stretches, though it required constant conscious attention that made conversation difficult and tactical awareness suffer. Walsh assured him it would become automatic eventually, muscle memory built through repetition. But Wade couldn't imagine how anyone practiced this enough for it to feel natural. The tongue position element proved even harder. Walsh demonstrated during a water break, tongue pressed against the hard palate, slightly cupped, creating what he called a moisture seal. Wade copied the position and immediately felt saliva pool in uncomfortable ways. His instinct was to swallow, clear the accumulation, return his tongue to its normal resting position at the bottom of his mouth. Walsh stopped him. Wade practiced the swallow pattern. It felt absurd, like learning to breathe manually or blink on command. But after 2 hours of conscious practice, he noticed his throat felt less raw, his thirst less urgent despite having drunk significantly less water than normal. The technique wasn't eliminating his need to hydrate, it was stretching the time between drinks, making each canteen last longer without reducing operational effectiveness. By day's end, Wade had consumed 1.5 canteens. The Australians had used roughly the same amount. Under normal circumstances, Wade would have emptied all 3 canteens and still felt dehydrated. The difference wasn't dramatic, maybe 20% improvement, but extrapolated over multi-day operations, that 20% meant an extra day of patrol range, fewer resupply requirements, reduced casualty rates from heat stress. Griffiths checked on him after they returned to base. "How'd you manage?" "Better than expected. Still can't maintain it consistently, keep reverting to old habits. But I see how it works now. Can't explain why it works, but I see the practical application." "That's further than most outsiders get. You want to teach it to your platoon?" Wade considered the question seriously. Teaching techniques he'd only practiced for 1 day felt premature, potentially dangerous if he demonstrated them incorrectly. But his men were still dropping from heat casualties, still limiting operational capability because human endurance was failing faster than mission requirements demanded. Quote 116, Griffiths agreed to loan Walsh for 3 days. The sergeant spent that time drilling Wade's platoon through the same exercises Wade had learned. Breathing patterns, tongue positions, swallow control. Some men picked it up quickly, showed immediate improvement in heat tolerance. Others struggled, couldn't break unconscious habits, felt foolish practicing techniques that seemed more like meditation than military training. Wade didn't mandate participation, just made it available, and let results speak for themselves. By day 7 on Terrican, Wade's platoon showed measurably better performance. Heat casualties dropped to 2 men, both of whom hadn't practiced the techniques. Patrol range increased by approximately 30%. Mission completion rates improved because men stayed functional longer under sustained heat stress. The improvement wasn't as dramatic as what Australian units achieved. They had months or years of practice compared to Wade's week, but the trend was undeniable. Wade filed a report with regimental command describing the training and recommending broader implementation. The response came back within 48 hours. Interesting observations, continue informal instruction if desired, no authorization for formal training protocol changes. Same institutional resistance that had blocked similar recommendations for 2 years. The knowledge would spread person to person or not at all. A war correspondent named Sullivan embedded with Wade's platoon during the second week, writing feature stories about the Borneo campaign for Stars and Stripes. He noticed the breathing patterns, asked questions about what the men were doing with their mouths during patrols. Wade explained the water discipline techniques, described the Australian training methods, provided statistical evidence of improved heat endurance. Sullivan wrote 600 words about it, framed as human interest, innovative field training helping American soldiers survive tropical conditions. His editor in Manila cut the section entirely. Too unusual to verify, potentially embarrassing if contradicted by medical experts, not the kind of story that fit established narratives about how soldiers prepared for combat. Sullivan protested, got overruled, watched the knowledge disappear into editorial discretion. Wade kept Walsh's demonstration notes, wrote his own training guide, expanding on techniques he'd learned, filed it with battalion records where it might survive as historical documentation, even if it never became official doctrine. Somewhere in the archive was evidence that men had known these methods, practiced them, benefited from them. Whether anyone would find that evidence decades later remained an open question that Wade couldn't answer. Dr. Fraser returned to Melbourne in January 1946, carrying 3 notebooks filled with observations that no medical journal seemed willing to publish. He'd submitted papers to the Australian Medical Journal, the British Medical Journal, even civilian physiology publications in the United States. The rejections followed similar patterns: interesting anecdotal evidence, insufficient experimental controls, conclusions that exceeded what the data could support, methodology that relied too heavily on field observations rather than laboratory conditions. The kindest rejection came from an editor at The Lancet who wrote that Fraser's findings represent potentially valuable field observations that require systematic laboratory validation before publication in a peer-reviewed medical venue. The subtext was clear. Wartime documentation didn't meet peacetime academic standards. What soldiers learned through necessity didn't qualify as science until researchers recreated it under controlled conditions with proper institutional oversight. Fraser tried to recreate those conditions. He secured a small research grant from the University of Melbourne, recruited 20 volunteers, half combat veterans who'd practiced water discipline techniques, half civilians with no military experience. He designed protocols measuring saliva production, oral moisture retention, core temperature regulation under controlled heat stress. The results matched his field observations. Veterans showed measurably superior hydration management, maintained function longer under thermal load, recovered faster after heat exposure. But when Fraser wrote up the results, the mechanism still eluded clear explanation. He could document that tongue position affected saliva distribution. He could measure that nasal breathing reduced respiratory water loss. He could demonstrate that controlled swallowing patterns changed oral hydration levels. What he couldn't explain was why these minor adjustments produced such significant cumulative effects. The sum exceeded the parts in ways that violated assumptions about how hydration physiology worked. He presented preliminary findings at a medical conference in Sydney, speaking to a room that was 3/4 empty because his session competed with presentations on penicillin applications and surgical techniques. The dozen attendees listened politely, asked technical questions about sample sizes and statistical significance, thanked him for his time, and moved on to the next presentation. Nobody followed up. Nobody requested his data for replication studies. The knowledge landed in the conference proceedings like a stone dropped into deep water, sinking without ripples. Dr. Chen contacted him in March, apologizing again for delays in her promised research. The University of Sydney had finally restored some laboratory capacity, but her department prioritized studies with immediate public health applications. Research into military hydration techniques that most people would never need didn't compete well against tuberculosis treatment protocols or maternal health initiatives. She hoped to resume the work eventually, perhaps in a year or two, but couldn't make promises about timeline. Fraser filed her letter with the rejection notices and his unpublished papers. He'd done what he could, documented the techniques, measured the outcomes, attempted to push the knowledge into institutional memory. If medical science wasn't ready to accept findings that emerged from field experience rather than laboratory discovery, he couldn't force the issue. The knowledge would survive in the men who practiced it, or it wouldn't survive at all. He opened a private practice in suburban Melbourne, treating everyday ailments in patients who cared more about quick recovery than scientific innovation. But he kept his research notes, updated them occasionally when veterans contacted him with additional observations, maintained hope that someone with better institutional access might eventually validate what he'd learned in New Guinea field hospitals. Corporal Davies returned to civilian life in Brisbane and found work as a surveyor, spending long days in the Queensland interior where heat management skills remained practically useful. He taught the water discipline techniques to younger crew members, framed it as practical knowledge for outdoor work rather than military training. Some learned it, most didn't bother, the usual pattern of knowledge transfer that favored motivated individuals over systematic adoption. In 1948, Davies encountered an American mining engineer named Carlson working on a project in the outback. The man was struggling with heat stress, going through water supplies faster than could be practically maintained. Davies showed him the breathing patterns, tongue positions, swallow control, the same techniques he'd learned from Milligan and taught to replacements during the war. Carlson practiced for 2 weeks and reported significant improvement in heat tolerance. Carlson said, "Davies didn't have a good answer. It is common knowledge for the people who need it most, just doesn't spread beyond that circle because nobody's figured out how to formalize it properly. You can't write a manual that captures muscle memory. You can't standardize something that requires individual adaptation. It exists in the space between what can be taught and what can be documented." Carlson tried to write about it for an American engineering journal, describing hydration management techniques for workers in extreme environments. His article was accepted but heavily edited, the specific techniques reduced to vague recommendations about mindful breathing and deliberate hydration scheduling. The practical details that made it work disappeared in favor of language that sounded scientific but conveyed nothing useful. Sergeant Milligan stayed in the Army, became a training instructor at Pukapunyal, taught infantry skills to peacetime conscripts who'd never see combat. He incorporated water discipline into his field training, demonstrated the techniques during exercises, encouraged practice without mandating it. Some instructors adopted his methods, others dismissed them as unnecessary peacetime refinements. The knowledge spread through certain training companies and skipped others entirely, creating uneven capability across battalions that would only become apparent if Australia faced another tropical conflict. In 1951, during exercises in Northern Territory heat that mimicked New Guinea conditions, soldiers who'd been trained by Milligan or his disciples showed markedly better heat endurance than those who hadn't. Medical officers noticed the pattern, requested information about training differences, received explanations that sounded familiar from wartime reports. The cycle repeated: documentation, measurement, recommendation for broader implementation, institutional hesitation about formalizing techniques that couldn't be properly systematized. A young military physician named Richards attended one of Milligan's training sessions, took detailed notes, tried to write standardized protocols based on observations. He produced a 10-page training manual describing breathing techniques, tongue positions, swallow patterns, practice schedules. The manual was technically accurate, but somehow missed the essential element that made the techniques effective. Soldiers who learned from the manual showed minimal improvement. Soldiers who learned directly from Milligan showed the expected benefits. Richards concluded that something in the personal instruction, the subtle corrections, the individual adjustments, the feedback loop between teacher and student, was essential to proper learning. The techniques required transmission through human demonstration rather than written instruction. He wrote this conclusion into his report, recommending that water discipline training remain instructor-led rather than manual-based. His superiors accepted the recommendation but didn't allocate resources for widespread instructor training, effectively ensuring the knowledge would remain confined to certain units rather than becoming universal army capability. Riley made captain, then major, eventually retired from the Rangers in 1953. He'd continued documenting hydration techniques throughout his career, taught them to special operations personnel who operated in extreme environments, built a reputation as the officer who knew obscure fieldcraft that improved survival rates. His unofficial training guides circulated among Ranger units, copied and recopied until the photocopies were barely legible, but never formally adopted into doctrine. He contacted Fraser in 1954, hoping the Australian doctor had made progress in getting the research published. Fraser's response was polite but discouraging. Still no academic acceptance. Still no institutional validation. Still waiting for someone with better credentials or better luck to push the knowledge into mainstream recognition. Riley filed the letter with his own collection of documentation that seemed destined for obscurity. Both men recognized the pattern. Knowledge that emerged from practical experience rather than controlled research struggled to gain scientific legitimacy. Techniques that worked consistently in field conditions but couldn't be explained through existing theoretical frameworks remained perpetually suspect. The institutional mechanisms designed to validate and preserve important discoveries weren't equipped to handle knowledge that violated assumptions about how information should be generated and transmitted. Fraser wrote in his personal journal, entry dated August 1954, "We documented something real and important. We measured it, tested it, confirmed it through repeated observation across thousands of soldiers. The techniques work. The benefits are undeniable. And none of it matters because we can't explain the mechanism in language that satisfies academic gatekeepers. So the knowledge will survive informally or not at all. And in 50 years, someone will rediscover it and think themselves clever for finding what we already knew." He wasn't wrong. But he also couldn't have predicted how long the cycle would take, or how completely the knowledge would fade before its eventual rediscovery under different names by researchers who'd never heard of Australian water discipline, or the men who practiced it in deserts and jungles halfway around the world. The reunion took place in Brisbane, 1987, a hotel conference room decorated with faded unit photographs and campaign medals displayed under glass. The 2nd 24th Battalion Association gathered annually, numbers thinning each year as men who'd stormed Pacific beaches aged into their 70s and 80s. Milligan attended despite the arthritis that made travel painful, drawn by the familiar faces and the knowledge that these gatherings wouldn't continue much longer. A university student named Rebecca Chen approached him during the afternoon session, introduced herself as Dr. Elizabeth Chen's granddaughter, explained she was researching wartime medical innovations for her history thesis. She'd found her grandmother's notes from Dobadura, read Fraser's unpublished papers, discovered references to water discipline techniques that supposedly improved heat endurance. The academic literature contained nothing about these methods. She wanted to know if they'd actually existed, or if the documentation represented wartime mythology that had grown in the retelling. Milligan laughed without bitterness. Oh, it existed. Still exists for those of us who remember. Come here. I'll show you something your professors will tell you is impossible. He demonstrated the tongue position, the breathing pattern, the controlled swallow. His movements were slower than they'd been 40 years earlier, but the muscle memory remained intact, encoded so deeply that age couldn't erase it. Rebecca recorded the demonstration on a video camera, asked permission to share it with her thesis advisor. Milligan agreed, but warned her the academic response would likely mirror what Fraser and Chen had experienced decades earlier. Polite skepticism followed by dismissal. Techniques that couldn't be explained through established physiological models made academics uncomfortable, especially when those techniques challenged assumptions about how knowledge should be generated and validated. She interviewed 6 other veterans that afternoon, recorded each man's explanation of the water discipline methods, documented the remarkable consistency in their descriptions, despite variations in terminology. They all described the same tongue positions, breathing patterns, swallow techniques. They all credited the training with keeping them functional in heat that killed less prepared soldiers. And they all expressed frustration that something so useful had never been properly preserved or transmitted beyond the informal networks of men who'd learned it through necessity. Davies sat with Milligan during a break, watching Rebecca conduct interviews with the methodical patience of someone who understood she was documenting knowledge that might not survive another decade. Quote 125, Davies asked. Quote 126, Milligan shrugged. Quote 127, Rebecca's thesis was completed in 1988, received honors recognition from the University of Queensland, and was filed in the library where it gathered dust alongside thousands of other academic works that documented interesting historical footnotes without sparking broader recognition. She submitted an article to a military history journal describing the water discipline techniques and their apparent effectiveness. The article was accepted but published in an obscure quarterly with circulation measured in hundreds rather than thousands. Meanwhile, in the United States, sports physiologists were beginning to study hydration optimization for endurance athletes. A researcher named Kowalski published findings in 1990 showing that specific breathing patterns and oral moisture management could extend athletic performance in heat. His work won recognition, spawned follow-up studies, eventually influenced training protocols for marathon runners and triathletes. The techniques he described were functionally identical to what Australian soldiers had practiced 50 years earlier, but Kowalski had never heard of Fraser's research or Milligan's training methods. He discovered the principles independently through laboratory experimentation, which gave his findings the academic credibility that field observations had lacked. By the late 1990s, similar techniques appeared in military training programs for desert warfare, repackaged as innovations developed through modern exercise science. Special operations units taught nasal breathing and saliva management to soldiers deploying to Middle Eastern conflicts, where heat remained a tactical factor. The training manuals cited recent research, made no reference to World War II Australian practices, treated the methods as contemporary discoveries rather than rediscovered knowledge. Fraser died in 1993. His research notes donated to the Australian War Memorial, where they joined millions of other documents in archives that few researchers ever examined. Milligan followed in 2001, his personal papers, including the training guide he'd written with Riley, filed away by family members who didn't understand their significance. Davies lived until 2008, long enough to see online articles about _quote _128_ that described methods he'd learned in Tobruk 67 years earlier. The last reunion of veterans who'd actually practiced the original water discipline techniques took place in 2012. 4 men attended, youngest of them 86 years old, sharing memories of training exercises and Pacific patrols, where staying alive depended on knowledge that military establishments had never properly valued. They demonstrated the techniques for a filmmaker documenting veteran oral histories, their movements still precise despite failing bodies, muscle memory outlasting almost everything else. One veteran, asked if it bothered him that the knowledge had been lost and rediscovered under different names, replied, "That's how it always works, isn't it? Men learn what they need to survive. Then the world forgets. Then new men learn it again when survival demands it. We weren't the first to figure this out. Won't be the last. The knowledge exists when it's needed. That's enough." The footage was archived, digitized, uploaded to historical databases where it remains accessible to anyone curious enough to search for it. The water discipline techniques that Milligan learned from Costas, that Davies taught to replacements, that Riley documented and Fraser measured, all of it survived in fragments, scattered across academic papers and military archives and veteran interviews. The institutional validation never came. The formal recognition remained elusive. But the knowledge persisted because some things proved too useful to completely disappear, even when the systems designed to preserve them fail. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this forgotten chapter of military history. If you found this story compelling, Support the video with a like. It helps more people discover these untold narratives from the past.